Well, hello. Hello and welcome. My name is Steve Kett, and I'm the Chief New Product Officer of the Advisory Board for the Arts. The Advisory Board is a membership organization, and on the call today are a wide variety of our members and our guests from 20 different countries all around the world. We welcome everyone to the conversation. We're grateful to all of you for taking time away at this very complex and challenging period to join this conversation. The topic for our discussion is this the Amazon moment for the arts? And joining us for this discussion are our guests. Alan Fletcher, President and CEO of the Aspen Music Festival and School. Larry Keeley, President and co-founder of Doblin Group and adjunct professor at the Kellogg School of Management. Dr. Stephen Klasko, President of Thomas Jefferson University and CEO of Jefferson Health. And Jasper Parrott, co-founder and executive chairman of Harrison Parrott. Many, many thanks to all of you for joining us today. Also joining me today as co-host is the founder and CEO of the Advisory Board for the Arts, Chris Denby. Chris will be helping to facilitate the conversation. Our plan is to run this discussion in 3 parts. First, we'll have our guests share a bit of their backgrounds. Second, Chris and I will ask a few specific questions to get the conversation going. And third, we'll have our guests respond to specific questions and comments that you all who are listening in today may have. And lastly, I wanted to remind everyone that we've extended today's conversation to 90 minutes, given the enormous importance of this topic. We hope that you all can stay for the full conversation. Now let me do just a bit of housekeeping before we begin. First, if you have a question at any time during the conversation, please type it into the chat box that you will find either at the bottom center of the screen or top center of the screen, depending on the view of Zoom that you're using. Chris and I are also joined today by our colleague Karen Freeman of our Advisory Board for the Arts research team, who will keep the Zoom trains running on time, as well as keep track of your questions. And later in our discussion, we will ask our guests to respond to as many of those questions as time permits. In fact, to get comfortable using the chat box, please go ahead and enter your name and where you're joining us from today, right now. And feel free, of course, to start entering your questions at any time. Also, as we begin, we've muted everyone's audio. This is simply to keep our discussion moving smoothly, avoid folks talking over one another, and most importantly, allowing everyone to hear Alan, Larry, Steve, and Jasper clearly. Again, if you do have a question, please type it into the chat box and we'll get to it later in our time together. Let's get started. As mentioned, we'll have a few questions in a moment, but before we get there, let's begin by having each of our guests share just a bit of their backgrounds. Alan, may I ask you to get us started?
Sure. So I've been 15 years now in Aspen. I came to the presenting world mostly from the academic world. I'm an active composer and was at leading academic institutions before I came into the more brilliant world of presenting.
Thank you very much, Alan. Jasper?
I've been working in the music business now for 54 years. I started my company in 1969, so we're celebrating in this unusual year our 50th anniversary. And I've been able to develop a very international business, working primarily for artists, but also in many different areas of the music and arts business.
Great, thank you very much, Jasper. Larry?
Thanks, Steve. I've been an innovation scientist for 4 decades. I help governments, philanthropies, and enterprises figure out how to innovate, especially when they're in difficult times and when the innovations that they need are more like transformations, bold and category busting or game changing. And I also teach the topic. So I've done that for 36 years and just passed 6,600 masters or PhD innovators I've trained around the world.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Larry. And Steve.
Hi, it's great to be here, and thank you, Steve and Chris, for inviting me. I'm a high-risk obstetrician, so other than the high risk, you might be wondering what I'm doing here. I run a 14-hospital system in Philadelphia and a university. It's a two-campus university. One is health sciences, and one is a design and arts university. I guess probably the most relevant part of my world is I'm a distinguished fellow of the World Economic Forum and have spent a lot of time with my colleagues in the World Economic Forum around the concept of disruption and the fact that there is no such thing as a non-disruptive disruption. And certainly this pandemic is potentially one of those opportunities.
Wonderful. Thank you very much to all of you. We're very appreciative of your taking the time to be here and honored to have you with us. Our topic today, business model transformation and disruption, is such a critically important and challenging one at any time. But in these literally unprecedented times, it's an almost overwhelming one. We obviously approach this entire conversation, therefore, with great empathy for what our colleagues, artists, and friends around the world are going through at this time. Also with great humility, knowing that none of us has the answers. There's nothing simple or obvious about this moment that we're all living through. But the idea in putting this discussion together was simply that if we in the world of the arts can benefit from examining the experience of others, that would be worthwhile. And that's why we're here. And so with that, I'm going to now pass this over to Chris to help frame the conversation for us and get us started.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome to everyone. Thank you to our four extraordinary guests today for joining us for this conversation. We are thrilled to have this dialogue begin here in this setting. We believe it is an extremely critical dialogue to be having actively at this point. In some respects, as we reflect on the issue of business disruption in this field, and as we think about all the conversations that we've been having with leaders in the arts world all across the world these last few weeks, we kept hearing this question of, things are going to change, right? We're not going to go back to normal. But yet very few being able to truly articulate a clear sense of how things are going to change. And frankly, whether we are going to be victims of change or perpetrators of change. And I think this theme of control versus victim is one of the big ones that we will want to talk about today. What is within our control as individual arts leaders? What are we able to shape when it comes to the future? If you think about other fields and how the question of business disruption has been studied over the years, we tend to be very, very good at looking retrospectively and being able to say, oh yes, that was a disruption that happened 10 years ago, 5 years ago. It's very, very difficult to see the forest through the trees as you're going through it in the very moment. In fact, oftentimes, and perhaps most of the time, one doesn't really realize in the moment the nature and size of the disruption that is occurring around us. We have a little bit of a leg up at this point in time, at this juncture. We know something is going on. We know something big is happening around us. And we know that there is at least the potential that things will look very different over the next few years. So the question is, how can we get ahead of it? Can we control it in any way? Can we be participants, or do we have to simply be aware of the massive changes that are occurring or could potentially be occurring? Those are some of the questions we want to explore today with our guests and with all the participants on this webinar, which is a reminder for me to say, please participate by contributing your comments in the chat box. Please ask questions of each other and of our guests as we go through, and we will pause during the conversation to take these questions and hopefully make this as much of a dialogue as possible. I thought we would start with a little bit of ground setting. We entitled this, "Is this the Amazon moment for the arts?" Well, what does that mean? And we thought to get us going in terms of answering that question, we would ask the person who actually coined that question for another sector that is sort of on the side here of our own, another nonprofit sector, healthcare. Steve Klasko, you wrote an article recently that got a lot of attention in the healthcare industry entitled, "Is this the Amazon moment for healthcare?" What did you mean by that?
Well, look, I think that for me, I believe, and I think it's true in both the arts and in healthcare, that there's going to be some pretty significant changes that would have happened anyhow, but that the supply, demand, and other issues and technology will, for the arts and healthcare, make them never the same. So what I meant is, and you know, obviously Amazon disrupted the retail sector. Uber disrupted the taxi sector. Airbnb disrupted the hotel sector. But what each of those did is literally look at technology in a different way and say, you know, I don't have to build bigger, better hotels than the Marriott anymore and build rooms. I can just connect people together. In healthcare, and we used to talk about heads and beds. I made my money by how many people come to a hospital. For an orchestra or a ballet or a theater, it might be butts and seats is really how things are viewed. I think that those are the things that are going to fundamentally change, that people are going to expect a different model. So just a few questions that we've asked ourselves, Chris, in healthcare that might make sense to ask in the arts is one, do you really need to exist as a standalone entity? So in Philadelphia, we have 43 hospitals. My guess is we don't have 43 separate hospitals. I think some of them will come together and share, and the same is true. We probably have 25 to 30 theaters. It's easy to start a nonprofit arts organization. It's pretty easy to start at a hospital, but the question becomes, what's the wisest choice for the community? I think the second question is, especially among smaller, whether it's hospitals or arts entities, do you need all that infrastructure? Is there a possibility to focus on your core mission and share some of the back office thing? To me, I think the biggest issue is going to be the distribution model. I had worked at Apple pre-iPhone era, and Steve Jobs had sort of his whole business plan was threefold. Year one, we changed. Year two, we changed the industry. Year three, we changed the world. And if you think about the computer industry, everybody was thinking about making smaller and better laptops or better operating systems. Steve was thinking about how technology was going to create a digital lifestyle. Now, I realized that the computer industry was 20 years old at that time, and the arts industry is several thousand years old. And I'm certainly not trying to suggest that technology.
Hey, Siri, good morning.
But I think that what is important is that just as we've learned that my model at healthcare has to go from being a sick care model of coming to my hospital to how can Jefferson help you at home thrive without health getting in the way, using telehealth, using continuous data, et cetera. I believe that a similar model might make sense for the arts, where literally if I enjoy theater or I enjoy ballet, it's not an either or, it's a both and. I want to go to the ballet, but I also want to have content delivered to me. And I'll end with this. Part of the idea behind the Amazon moment, and I said this, I said, you know, I want to be Target or Walmart. And I gave a talk at Wharton and somebody asked, what do you mean? I said, well, when Amazon disrupted retail by saying, hey, you no longer have to go to a store. You can go to, you can do it online. There are some retailers that said, oh my God, I got to close all my stores and go all online. In the United States, there's something called Circuit City that did that, and it was a disaster. There are others in our country that said, like Macy's, Sears, and Penny's, what a stupid fad. Nobody's ever gonna, the day after Thanksgiving, go and not go to the mall. Well, those places have failed also. Target and Walmart said, we are really good at what we do, but we also have to recognize, especially among younger folks, this is going to be a new distribution model, and we're going to be both. That's what we've tried to do at Jefferson. If you have, God forbid, pancreatic cancer, you're going to come to my hospital, and we're going to provide great care. But we also want to be there for somebody who's counting 10,000 steps on their Fitbit is healthy. Again, I believe the arts will have a very similar model that literally I want to subscribe to this ballet, to this orchestra, to this theater, to this art museum, and be able to go and enjoy that, but also be able to stay home and have a subscription model. So those are just some of the things that I think are relevant within that context.
Thank you, Steve. Larry, I'd like to turn to you in a second here for your thoughts. You know, we're talking about innovation, we're talking about disruption. We've heard a lot of individual names of organizations that have innovated and perhaps therefore disrupted industries, Amazon, Uber. Does it always begin with a single organization? And therefore, are the arts only going to be disrupted if there is a single player who leads the way? Or does innovation and disruption occur on a broader level than just beginning with a single organization?
Lovely question, Chris. I would like to say that innovation is nearly always rooted in a sort of background medium of usually confusion, chaos, and fear. To a very large extent, the roots of innovation are around things that are driving you crazy. Whenever there is a sense of difficulty, a sense of you know, this is simply not working, there becomes a nagging accumulation of little pieces of evidence that whatever you've been good at aren't working anymore. And that tends to happen in a category more or less broadly and more or less simultaneously. That's the reason why, Chris, scientists have had a term that they've used for 177 years called simultaneity of discovery. Rooted in that term is the understanding that the mechanisms of great breakthroughs are very often widely distributed. There are lots of precursors, lots of things that happen before this moment, either to cause the problem or to create the sort of little seed beds of little solutions. And that's why when we try to give people an innovation competence, part of what we're doing is to give them enhanced curiosity, to try to have peripheral vision, to see what kinds of innovations are happening elsewhere. But more broadly, Chris, I think the really interesting thing that our participants and guests could be thinking about today, consistent with Steve's notion that this may be the Amazon moment, is the widespread evidence that artists everywhere, especially performance artists that are dependent upon butts and seats, to borrow his phrase, are simply at the edge of, you know, starvation, survival moment, an existential threat. One of my favorite generic strategies that I like to give almost any organization thinking about innovation is how you flip adversity to advantage, how you think about doing something profoundly and fundamentally new, typically rooted in trying to dig yourself out of some challenge that you're in. As an analogy, so that we stop talking in abstractions and give our guests a specific way to think about that, I'm mindful of a case that I did way back in 1995 for Chicago's public radio station. For those of you in Europe, it's sort of a similar business model to the BBC. People donate money and get to hear supposedly advertising-free, high-quality radio. And I was the board member and head of strategy in Chicago's public radio station. It was hard for me to point out to the other board members, crammed to the gills with lawyers and bankers, that we really needed to innovate, that our business model was ancient and dramatically needed to be reinvented. In effect, we were spending our scarce resources producing things like brief newscasts about sports yesterday, the weather today, or the traffic in our city in Chicago at this moment. And I said, none of those investments got cumulatively more valuable over time. I reminded our board members that storytelling has always been a need human beings have had since human beings, started to develop language. And I said, we just needed to find a different way to do that. We invented a radio program called This American Life. I'm certain that some of our 144 guests will have been familiar with it because it debuted in November 17th, 1995. It will hit its 25th anniversary in just a few months. And Ira Glass was the piece of talent behind this extraordinary storytelling radio show. I want to emphasize that as a innovation strategist and a planner, I had nothing whatsoever to do with the genius creative side of This American Life. That was completely about Ira Glass, his vision, and his network of friends, among them a guy named David Sedaris, who was making his money cleaning, the apartments and homes of wealthy people as a glorified cleaning person. And he was just barely eking out a living when he was able to work with Ira Glass and create things like Standalone Diaries, one of the most famous radio episodes in the history of the world. He moved from a guy just barely making a living to one of the best paid live performers in the history of the world, similar to what Mark Twain did 100 years ago. And that's just an example of what Ira Glass has done inside of one particular radio program to create not only great episodes, we're now over 600 episodes, that are distinctive and interesting and compelling, so compelling that every week when we go live, 2.1 million people listen to them live typically, and another 3.2 million download them every week. In our 24 years of existence, This American Life has been the #1 downloaded podcast in the world approximately 40 or 41 weeks of every year. It's had spin outs, and it's created an ecosystem of the 90 best producers in radio. This is one of the most important things, Chris and Steve, that I think our listeners could take away as one of the greatest principles about this extraordinary time of challenge and change. If you pay enough attention to how you reinvent your business model for this adversity, you may not only eke out a different kind of survival in the short run, you may set the conditions for a completely different way of thriving in the middle term and in the long term. That's certainly what has happened around This American Life. We quickly ended up with the 90 best producers in radio, a farm team of talent that are not only, David Sedaris, but people that each became famous in their own right: Sarah Vowell, David Rakoff, Scott Carrier, dozens of other people that have been pulled out of obscurity, barely able to make a living, and are now really quite celebrated celebrities in their own right. We've even had other spin-outs, such as the podcast called Serial, which is very often the #2 downloaded podcast in the world. So creating a way to flip adversity to advantage is the principle I'd like to seed our conversation with today. There are structural patterns about how you do that, but the most important thing to pay attention to is the business model shift.
I like your focus on turning adversity into opportunity, and I'd like to piggyback on that in just a minute. But before we do that, I'd like to ask Jasper and Alan to just respond for 1 second around this question of the framing here around, is this the Amazon moment for the arts? Maybe starting with you, Alan, what does that resonate to you as a question for us in this field right now, and especially the way it's been defined for us so far in this conversation?
Yes, absolutely. I do want to say artists always adapt. That is what we do. And never in my career has there been a moment where adaptation is so clearly needed. As you said, Chris, sometimes one doesn't know that we're going through a change. Now we do know that. And so just a few very quick things. You gave me 1 second. All of us in the past couple of weeks have had to decide how to announce that we're canceling a lot of what we do. And it's been quite striking to me. One trope, which is certainly understandable, is I am heartbroken. I don't know what we're going to do. This is the worst moment ever. It's just been a terrible, terrible decision to make. By contrast, some people, I'm going to call out Joseph Hodge at the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis, who gave a very eloquent message full of hope and full of enterprise. And yet, one thing Joseph says, which is a little contrary to our discussion, is we need to come back to having people share an experience in real time all together. That's the essence of theater. When you have something that's a highly contrived product pre-recorded, that has a name, which is film. And I also am convinced myself that one thing we're going to really understand after this is over, whatever that means, is something that a lot of us have always said, which is that live music has a meaning, has a purpose, has a significance, has a value, which is extremely different from products that are made out of recording. Mm-hmm. I think the public will get that now in a way they have never understood before. So that could be a positive if we're ever able to come back together. As you know, Chris, I have some ideas about so-called coordinated performance, about opportunities in educational and in information apparatus for performance, and in competition among organizations, which maybe we'll get to later.
Yeah. Can I just make a comment? I think what's great about what you said, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and. And I think the optimistic view could be that this could expand the audience that wants to see this. When the iTunes store was opened and people said, oh my God, nobody's ever going to listen to an album again. Nobody's ever going to go to a live performance again. They can just get each song. The reaction to that was live performances bloomed. Vinyl came back, because people said, I'd like to listen through the whole album, but it created a new, if you will, generation of music lovers. So I think it's a both and as opposed to an either or, potentially.
Jasper, I want to turn to you for a minute before we move on to our next sort of subtopic, and just you speak to leaders in the arts world every day. You work with artists, and you have for decades. As you look at this moment, Jasper, do you think the question of, is this a Amazon moment for the arts, is a valid one? Is it a good one to be talking about? Does it resonate?
I think that it resonates, but I think it's in a way a diversion, because I think in fact what we have not recognized is that there have been a whole series of Amazon moments going on, especially with accumulating speed in the last few years. And it's to do with something which is fundamentally out of date, because basically most of the way, in most parts of the world, the way that the performing arts particularly, but also fine arts of other kinds, is delivered to the public is in a model, according to a model, which is basically a 19th century model. It's also, there is an innate friction between the central contribution of the artists, the framework within which they are actually displayed, which is the institution, and there is the distribution itself, which has taken all sorts of different forms. And I mean, for me, one of the most telling issues that we are having to look at and think about, and I don't see much evidence of it yet, is that around the world, we have an immense infrastructure of concert halls, opera houses, museums, galleries, other sort of inclusive spaces in which the arts are in a way distributed to the public. And these are probably more or less no longer fit for purpose. But the fact that they're not fit for purpose is not actually only COVID-19, but it's also because of climate change. It's also because of massive problems with regard to the democratization of the participation in the arts. It's also to do with many other social issues which are not being addressed. And there is also, I would say, at the heart of it all, there is the fundamental question of what is the value of artistic activity and how is this presented to and supported in a good and healthy society. So that the Amazon moment, I think, in the end, is about how we value the arts, how we protect it, how do we actually integrate the artistic creativity within a larger value system.
Right. No, that's a very interesting way of thinking about it, Jasper. Thank you. I want to turn to an aspect of this that is near and dear to our hearts, which is that it's very easy to delve into an academic conversation about disruption, about change, about what may or may not have happened in the past, what may or may not happen in the future. But at the end of the day, the only reason it is interesting is if it can lead to some sort of practical implications for all of us on this webinar, right? So at 12:30 or wherever time zone you're in, at the end of this time, you go back to your daily business. What does it all mean? What do you then go and do? We, as I said earlier, we do have a little bit of the benefit of recognizing that we are in a moment. The question is, what do we do with that advantage that we have of realizing we are in that moment? What do we have in our control? And Larry, I'd like to turn to you first to ask this essential question of what practical advice would you give, having studied how other organizations, how other sectors have handled disruption, given where we are right now in late May of 2020, given what is ahead of us, given the acknowledgement of the massive amount of change, what's the practical implications that we can talk about here for leaders of arts organizations in terms of what they should be doing right now?
Well, what a lovely question, Chris, and I think it's the right one to be asking. I can tell from the chat room that people are in a lot of pain and doing a lot of work to try to anticipate the ways in which they could address the moment we're in. Let me give you very practical advice. The one thing is absolutely trust the talent. The one thing I'm absolutely certain about is that the individual artists, the performers, will have a rich panoply of absolutely inspiring and great ideas that they would like to be doing, a part of their personal expression, a part of their authentic response to the very scary moment we're all immersed in, or even their ability to express the pain that they've been going through in their personal lives. That's the absolute heart of the basis for doing something that other humans will resonate with. So trust the talent is principle number one. Principle number two is get your unfair share of attention. Do something to create a riveting, emotionally resonant experience around those talented individuals that people will in fact respond to. You're seeing a gazillion examples of this all over the world. In the Getty Museum in California, they're creating this Getty Challenge, inviting people to recreate in their own homes something that's inspired by a painting that's famous around the world. Museum of Modern Art in New York is creating virtual visits, carefully curated every day with deep immersions into a particular artist that they have in different galleries in MoMA. But you can also learn from anybody that's used the technology in hybrid ways. Whatever you think of Louis C.K., he's been a bit of a creep, and he's been rightly pilloried for that. One of his greatest innovations was to put his stand-up comedy into a different kind of business model, where he basically said, enjoy it if you want, throw me $5 if you can. And just by asking to do things that way, he managed to raise vastly more money than he'd ever had in his life doing things for HBO online or on conventional, premium cable TV. He also created a world where he could invite other struggling comics in and give them the same access to millions of enthusiastic viewers. So here's a practical suggestion for you, Chris. Imagine a world where anyone with the ability to do live performances in opera, in symphony, in performance arts of any kind, invites, among others, healthcare workers who have already had corona and therefore have some antibodies. Invite those people to be in the physical audience, provide a virtual experience that's televised, offer it up for a small donation. I'm going to say illustratively £5 in Europe, $5 in the United States, but clearly indicate that of that $5, $4 or £4 is going to be used to create a beneficial program for struggling artists, and talk about what you're doing to benefit those struggling artists. That's an example of a great experience that's physical for some people who can safely gather, that has a different kind of business model. It does do that principle I described earlier of flipping adversity to advantage. It's got this inspiring story about it, and it's a great performance that people will want to see. That's a practical example, Chris, of how you hybridize the competencies you're used to using to create a kind of new business model that's right for this moment and inspiring to people who are suffering and bored and scared in their homes.
Yeah, for sure. I want to turn to, again, if our obsession here is how do you navigate, how do you figure out what your steps ought to be, and it's hard. There's a lot of conflicts going on right now. There's a lot of craziness. There's a lot of urgency and anxiety. And so being able to see clearly and take actions clearly is complicated. Steve Kett, I know that you had some thoughts to contribute to the group in terms of perhaps a framework that you've seen used in other industries that may be helpful to sort of organize our thinking when it comes to navigating the imminent disruption that we all feel is occurring and coming. Would you mind sharing that with us?
Absolutely. It's an idea or a framework from outside our world in the arts, from a gentleman who's actually the chief executive officer of Ford Motor Company here in the States. His name is Jim Hackett, and it is his framework called Now, Near, and Far has been widely discussed and disseminated at this point. But the core of the idea is that in any volatile and uncertain environment, when you're trying to engage in some kind of planning or proactive kind of looking forward, you need to keep in mind three distinct time frames: now, near, and far. And they are not a continuum. So it is not now, then near, then far. You need to think about those three time frames simultaneously. So the first step is to decide, or as a leadership team, keeping your mission front and center, to decide what the far is. What do you believe the far is going to be? And then even now, as you're running the organization, to be pivoting to that far. You obviously pivot through the near to get there. But I think, and just to be clear, the now, near, and far is in terms of the actual number of years or months that it is, varies completely by situation. But the idea of thinking in terms of now, near, and far can be helpful, I think, as everyone's engaged in so much scenario planning and planning of all sorts in their organizations these days.
Thank you. I want to turn to Jasper and Alan as we continue a journey down the path of practical. One of the things that is valuable at this juncture, at least we feel, is to have some understanding of what the possible disruptions are that could be coming down the road, because we all tend to have a certain framework around which we think about what is likely to happen. And it comes from our own setting, our own art form, but oftentimes sort of hearing it from a number of different perspectives in terms of what people are even talking about as potential futures is helpful. Alan, maybe we can start with you. As Steve Klasko did in his article on the Amazon moment for healthcare, he thought about 4 or 5 specific changes that he expects could very well happen and disrupt that industry in fundamental ways. As you begin to think about it, Alan, are there 2 or 3 in the arts that you think are going to be or could be examples of the things that are going to fundamentally change?
Well, see if this is an answer to your question. I'm not certain it is, but first of all, listening to Larry and Steve, I think we're going to need quickly to learn how to monetize virtual content. This summer, Aspen Music will be putting up a lot of virtual content, and we're going to do it free because that feels right in this moment. But in the longer term, in the near maybe, we're going to have to figure out how to make money from this. One thing I've seen that I think will prove sticky in this, I'm thinking of something, I think it was on Philadelphia Orchestra's website that I saw, is a really interesting educational, informational armature to a performance, which is maybe an archival performance. But all of a sudden you have sort of like a board game to Mahler 1 that you're playing as you experience the performance. And I just thought that was brilliant and is something that I would like to see 10 years from now still happening. Another thing I was thinking about in Larry's comments is that whereas in the past, let's say LA Phil does not really compete with Chicago Symphony in any real way. Aspen Music Festival doesn't compete with Tanglewood, but now we do, because now everything's going to be virtual, online, available to anyone in the world. And we need to make products that are... Sorry, I'm having a dog eruption. I'm gonna try moving around. We need to make products that are stamped with our own mission so that it's not just the same thing everybody else is doing. And that's the challenge, but I think it's a challenge we can all address. Now I'm gonna...
Alan's point, Chris, is truly excellent in the sense that when you do try to think differently about your business model, it routinely brings you into an ecosystem of very different competitors, very different complementors, very different partners. That can seem scary, but you can also see it as an extraordinary new freedom to be able to build exciting new capabilities with other celebrities that you sort of bring in. I think we've been watching lots of innovations and things like virtual Saturday Night Live presentations that have been in part leveraged by the ability to bring folks in. And whatever you're trying to do in your arts organization, pretty much count on Lin-Manuel Miranda being bored in his house too. That gives you an opportunity to potentially create new kinds of partnerships that may, in fact, help you to get your unfair share of attention.
Yeah. Jasper, I'd like to turn to you and get your, you have such vast experience and perspective from all around the world, and you're observing all of this going on. In your mind, what are the 2 or 3 things that either will or could happen that will fundamentally disrupt this industry in the next few years?
Well, one of the things I concern myself very much with at the moment is what I consider to be the sort of neglect of the power of and the authority of the artist. Because to me, it is astonishing that with this all of these incredible difficulties, which the arts sector is facing, there seems to be a very widespread opinion that somehow the independent artists, who are in a way, I think, the lighthouses of everything that we value and are concerned with, also in terms of innovation and new solutions, are somehow left unsupported by the majority of the institutions which actually have the power. And I find this quite incomprehensible, because without those artists, how do we actually seek to have quality, management of the of leadership in terms of the actually art forms that are under consideration, and also, of course, the appeal to the public, which is also part of the process of the monetization. And there have been such an incredibly wide range of different attitudes towards this. I think that some institutions, although they're very, very hard pressed, have done a great and generous work in finding ways of giving support to the artists so that they can still take the leadership role which we've all counted on in order to find the new, help find the new solutions. And of course, one of the problems that we are going to face is the difference between different sectors, because when it comes down to performing great works of the orchestral repertoire, there needs to be the capability of playing together, of ensemble, of rehearsal, of the spaces in which actually these works were conceived, so that in fact the quality can be maintained. And one of the difficulties I find in the digital world, which we are all, of course, engaged with varying degrees of excitement, and is how much more difficult it is actually to judge quality, and how much more difficult it is also to create the environment in which art will grow. Now, one of the positive things about the disruption, as I see it, is that actually the role for the innovator in terms of the contemporary area of music and the arts, and in fact in every art form, has suddenly become much more present, much more real, and has had much greater opportunities. And I think that this is one of the things that I hope very much will come out in very positive terms as we move forward to whatever the new reality is going to be, which of course is going to be absolutely nothing like what we have known it to be until this beginning of this year.
No, thank you, Jasper. So I want to, at the risk of opening up Pandora's box, because what I'm about to talk about is a little bit of the 10,000-pound gorilla at this point. And it's been raised by Alan, it's been raised by several others in the chat room already, which is this question of the role of digital going forward, right? And so everyone assumes that part of the disruption, part of how the industry is going to change, is that in some way, shape, or form, live streaming, digital distribution of content in the arts is going to play a much larger and more fundamental role to the existence of any arts organization. We don't know exactly how. We don't know if it's going to be a 10% larger role or a 100% larger role. We also know, or at least assume and want, and certainly from the comments in the chat room, it's very clear, need to figure out a way to monetize that. So I want to, if you don't mind my putting you on the spot, Larry, I want to, as you listen to this and perhaps compare that sentiment in this field, perhaps to other similar situations in other industries, how do you react to this assumption that that distribution channel is going to add itself to the fundamental value proposition of each of these organizations? And how should they be thinking about this question of monetization in the broader product portfolio, if we put it that way, of an arts organization?
Again, a really thoughtful question, Chris. Thanks. I think about it as different modes of value creation. And it really is important for our arts organizations participating today to imagine that standing in the future, they need to have a different set of tools in their toolbox. Think about it as in our virtual mode, the kinds of things we'd like to do are X, Y, and Z. And the reasons we need to do that is to meet people that live farther away from us, to deepen the relationships with performers that we engage virtually, to create an awareness of our brand, and to create a stream of revenues that allow us to survive in the short run and thrive in a different way in the midterm or long term, to borrow, you know, Steve Kett's Jim Hackett framework. But I'd like to also emphasize that we should not be blinded to the very real possibility that this is going to change faster than people imagine. I'm doing the innovation strategies in New Zealand, a country that is already much farther down the pathway to creating a healthy way to re-engage society, to, as I like to call it, reboot society. And in that case, one of the things we're emphasizing is the extraordinary role of artists, performers, comedians, musicians, to be able to gather people, fearful people, once again in public, when in fact the epidemiologists say it's safe to do so. So I want to emphasize, and I hope the arts organizations participating hear this clearly, there is an absolute reason to believe that it's the arts and the artists that you represent, that you in fact have in your own ecosystems, that will give everyone the reason to reemerge, however fearful they are, and to remember the fact that that's why we're humans. We like to be around one another, and we like to have memorable, emotionally resonant experiences. However well hidden it is, Chris, in this moment of difficulty and sometimes desperation, what we have specifically for arts organizations is the invitation, once again, to be extraordinary, to be inventive, and to do the things that remind human beings what it is to be human, whether you're celebrating or expressing fear and anxiety and sorrow and grief. These are the opportunities for greatness. And think about it as multiple modes, the ways you're going to do it virtually sometimes, but increasingly opening the aperture to participating in ways that are safe and in person, or hybrids of those, Chris.
Right. No, thank you. Jasper, I want to ask you a question that actually comes from the chat room that pertains to what we were just discussing, a very practical question, which is, to the extent that there becomes, in the future, there is a much bigger role for digital and content distribution through digital, whether it's live or not, what does that mean for artists? How will artist fees specifically be adapted to that new environment if it becomes a much larger portion of the portfolio of work that they do?
Well, this is, I think, one of the most difficult questions that we face, because how do you actually put a price to the experience of art? And when you, in fact, introduce the technological and the transmission element of art, where do you draw the line? What is it that actually you support? Where is it that you invest in the development of the artistic world? How long does it take? How do you deal with the education of talented people? How do you nurture them when they are not yet able to be, if you like, monetizable? These things seem to me to be very, very fundamental, again, to the societal approach towards what the arts world is about, which is partly to do with a very deep and long investment in something quite unique and quite extraordinary, and which is also provides the leadership and the lines in which actually different art forms develop. And it's partly to do with, of course, the excitement of the now. It's the creativity of the experience now, which will in many cases be very experimental. I mean, when I think about my own company and about how it may evolve and develop, what I like to come back to is the idea that we should be in some ways the laboratory of everything, in which we can also bring in the stars and the artists who are going to be the great creators, which this laboratory will then be able to help them to form and develop in all of their myriad different ways.
First, I think in some respects, this is a corollary with health, because it really forces you to look in the mirror and say, what am I doing that absolutely requires that human experience? And how do I differentiate something in person versus digital? And by the way, people have very different views on that. My son is an MFA from Columbia, and he is very conservative about that's what they call television, that's what they call film. Theater is theater. I have the same thing with doctors. It's saying, telehealth is a cute little novelty, but it's not the same as coming to my office. I think that there's two things about that. One is that I think there's some generational shifts in how people view that. And I think younger folks, are looking for both. I also think there's some haves and have-nots issues. And let me just give you one quick example in healthcare. I'm working with a company that's doing pregnancy monitoring at home. And the issue is the way we get paid, et cetera, that hasn't really taken off. Well, the fact that hasn't taken off has really been one of the reasons we have one of the largest perinatal morbidities in the country, in the world, between the haves and the have-nots. Because everybody has to take off from work, go to a hospital 3 days a week, pay $35 to park in Philadelphia to get their testing. In places like the Netherlands, where it's mostly done at home, it's easier to do. So I think that you can create a greater audience, I still believe, without deteriorating your product and making sure that you differentiate the product that does require humans to be there.
Yeah.
So I'd like to jump in, if I may, and underline, first of all, something Jasper said a few minutes ago, which is in real experience in the past months, it is the artists, in our case, the musicians, who are leading the way and are finding the innovations. And one of my colleagues, who's an executive, said last week, we executives have to take a completely different view now. And we have to not rely on the way things have always been, because the artists themselves are not relying on the way things have always been. They are finding ways forward. And I think it resonates with what Steve Klasko was saying, that the new models, well, we just have to find them. So as two concrete examples, which are on the negative side, I saw a beautiful thing in the German airport of one-on-one concerts. And so a musician is playing with one seat in front of the musician and one person is listening. I thought, well, that is gorgeous, but that's not a business model going forward. A different thing is the so-called coordinated performance, in which, well, we've all seen them, and they can be very moving, but they're a stunt. That is not real music making. That's a form of glorified practicing. As a presenter, my favorite thing is rehearsal, even more than performance. But the coordinated performance doesn't really have rehearsal. It's just a series of people practicing their parts, and then an engineer putting it together. So fundamentally, I think this goes to something Steve was saying, or maybe Larry. I do believe, it's Larry, I do believe we are going again to be able to be together in groups and experience art. So the question is, what will we have learned from this? And to me, one of the big things is going to be the armature of the experience, how one prepares, what's online, what's available, to make the audience experience more vividly what they are indeed experiencing together. So about 20 years ago, I was at Carnegie Mellon University, the academic side, but because we had such fantastic computer engineers, I challenged the music faculty to figure out what must be done in person and what can be done virtually. That was 20 years ago. And at first, a lot of faculty members said, everything has to be in person. That's what we always do. And then they begin to find that certain aspects of studying musicology, certain aspects of music theory, etc., can really be done very effectively in a virtual setting. And it makes the in-person even more vivid and important.
Alan and Jasper, can I just ask a question about that? Is there a way, or can you think of some examples where if I'm getting excited about going to the Philadelphia Opera or the Pennsylvania Ballet, that there are things that could happen digitally before that performance that would get me more excited about it or get me more ready for it? Is that another opportunity in a subscription type model?
Yeah, absolutely. Because right now, all of us probably have a capability that you go online and you read program notes ahead of time, and you can listen ahead of time to a recording of the piece, and it deepens your experience. And absolutely, it does that. But the thing I was mentioning about Philadelphia Orchestra is a sort of a game that you can play that brings you into the flow of the music, into the narrative of the music, into the storytelling, in a way that's different from just reading a program note or listening to the piece in advance of listening to the piece.
Alan, I'd love to pile on to this really beautiful speculation you're sharing with everybody. Kevin Kelly, the brilliant originating editor of Wired magazine, has been asking a question for 20 years when he says, you know, one of the problems with modern information is that information wants to be free. Everybody expects to get it endlessly and for free over the internet. And so he's been asking the question, well, what's better than free? What can you do to create something that people will care so much about that it's a completely different form of expression, a completely different experience than what they're used to? And in your speculation, Alan, one of the things that could start to happen around performances is to create the entire beautiful digital archive around an event, an experience. So if I'm going to be learning about the magic flute, I might like to learn about the history. I might like to have a smart archive that shows me what it was like with period instruments, that shows me what was going on in Mozart's life at that time. These are the kinds of things that already exist, but to a very large extent, it takes an extremely devoted and passionate partisan of the arts to be able to immerse, usually a student, to immerse themselves in all of that surround. There's simply no reason why in modern times the arts organizations working in distributed ways couldn't create smart archives that end up becoming extremely important as a brand new way to deepen our understanding of anything, like the cello Bach suites and their history and the way in which they've changed through the years and been interpreted by great performers or great artists or new kinds of instrumentality even. So I think that that's one of the speculations that's going on. And Chris, I also think it's great to acknowledge the really thoughtful conversation emerging in the group chat room that's really about the importance of unions. Most people in times of change think that unions are points of friction, that they will always be resistant to change, that they will always be the naysayers. My experience is that that's not the case when you get to extremely difficult existential moments like this. And to a very large extent, one of the things that I think could end up being another revolutionary part, consistent with what Alan is describing and speculating about, is business models that would be specifically designed to acknowledge and to reward sort of union members and create incentives for those individuals to help us find our way through the difficulties to the next generation models. That sounds a little bit Panglossian, but it's been my experience that when you bring enough empathy and enough cultural anthropological insight to what the unions are really going through, you can just simply expand your frame of what you're trying to innovate into, so that in fact you're really helping the unions to help their members, even as you try to find the new hybrid models that make a difference.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Larry. And I'd be curious for anybody else's comment, Jasper, Steve, around Alan, around this question of, in any moment of disruption, in any change, there are usually complex players and dynamics at play that come in the way or end up shaping the way that disruption happens. And one of these very complex dynamics is unions, as has been mentioned in the chat room and by Larry. What are your thoughts there about how to engage in that conversation in a productive and positive way?
Well, again, I'll just start in my world. You know, we have three values at Jefferson: do the right thing, put people first, and be bold and think different. And we sat down with our unions, with our environmental service workers that we knew were going to be going into COVID patients, and made some of those trade-offs at the beginning. Their thing was, look, we want to make sure that you're doing everything possible to not have any of us get infected by COVID. And we did. I mean, things that were 22 cents are now $20, but we just got the best of everything. Now there's a trade-off to that, because the COVID for healthcare is the first time ever that doing the right thing is going to make you lose a lot of money. But the unions recognize that we did the right thing and that there might be some trade-offs on the other side that we have to deal with because we did that. But we had that discussion early on. And I think, having the discussion, I would imagine, with the arts unions, with the musicians and others, help us figure out what creatively we can do as we get out of this so we can help each other, I think would be a really, really great thing. So we're not just thinking, let's only have half the number of seats that we had before.
Yeah, my perception is that the unions in the music world have been hugely positive and helpful in thinking this through, and it's a corollary to the fact that the musicians are in the lead in terms of innovation.
Jasper, anything to add to that?
Well, I think that the way that unions function in terms of the general welfare of the arts organizations around the world is so enormously different, and it might be impertinent for me to comment too much about the situation currently in the United States. But I would have said that prior to COVID-19, my perception would have been that the whole performing arts structure in the United States in the major cities is caught in a sort of rigor mortis of inability to change and adapt. And that the model that was established in the glory days of the 70s, when everybody believed in 52 weeks of fully paid activity and all of the other benefits. These, of course, were major achievements and very valuable in terms of actually enhancing the quality of life of all those people involved. But there is a point at which, when you have a sort of competitive gridlock of control, where everything costs progressively more and more incrementally every year, where the capability of innovation, the capability of novelty, in a way, the capability of taking of the value of small things in the arts becomes, I think, tremendously blocked. And I think that that particular problem, unfortunately, may be changed through failures, bankruptcies, organizations going out of business. And in a way, the artistic quality, which could have changed and brought about change, may be smothered or in a way pushed to one side because it's not seen to be majoritarian enough.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to questions from our chat room in a minute, but I want to encourage all of our participants. We've heard over the course of the last 20 minutes or so a number of ideas from Jasper, from Alan, and others around what could change, what is likely to be the drivers of massive disruption. I'd be curious for anybody who's participating here, feel free to add in the chat room any additional ideas you might have of ways that this industry, this field, could change dramatically or is likely to change dramatically, especially ones that we haven't talked about so far. So feel free to add them in the chat room if you've got any additional ones that you've been thinking about in terms of either your organization, your industry, your field within the arts.
Yes.
Really, yes, please, Steve.
I was just going to, speaking of the chat room, I've seen it a couple of times now, the mention of failing, but failing fast and learning. And Alan, you and I were talking the other day about that notion, about the idea of experimenting, and some of them won't work. And we've got to accept that, learn from that, and move on, rather than, unless we're sure it works, we're not going to put our toe in the water. Anything to add to this notion of, taking some chances, experimenting, even with limited resources, and understanding we'll fail, but see that as, chances to really innovate and learn?
Yeah, well, certainly. It's curious that not even a year ago, a lot of us were being told that our business model was would lead to rigor mortis, as Jasper says, because we're so dependent on philanthropy, and that a much better business model would depend on earned income. Now, curiously, the people most dependent on earned income are the most likely to fail in the short term. And those of us who are more dependent on philanthropy, if we're lucky, and in Aspen we are extraordinarily fortunate to have philanthropists who are going to stay with us. And now what I'm hearing is they want us to innovate. And that's going to be the basis for a really great philanthropic case, is look at all of the things we have thrown against the wall to see if they stick. And so I think the organizations able and willing and confident enough to do some really different things are going to be the ones with legs.
Steve, can I just comment on that? I think, in healthcare, we don't get a chance to fail because there are too many malpractice attorneys around. But the simple fact is that when we think about philanthropy, I think we're going to move, and I think you put it very well, we're going to move from a model where folks are giving money now to support whether it's artists or folks involved in the arts industry because of how they're hurting. In our case, it's a Better Together fund for our vulnerable employees, to supporting innovative ways out of this. And I think that there will be more philanthropy, both in health and the arts, for those that can really talk about what they're doing and doing differently, and get people excited about, if you will, the reimagining of whether it's arts or healthcare.
And if I could pile on too, Chris, just for a moment. I really like Alan's elegant point. With benefactors, they want to have an impact. They want to know that they're making a difference, and they're usually quite good at being conceptually adroit around moments of change. So think of your benefactors as providing the seed corn, the crystals of a brand new future, a little bit of money that in the hands of very clever artists can turn into these galvanizing experiences that are wrapped in new business models. As the leaders of arts organizations, your job is to understand very clearly what victory looks like. What are the new kinds of metrics, incentives, rewards that you want to drive towards, such as deepening relationships, broadening your ecosystem, creating new kinds of modes of expression. Your benefactors should be the folks that give you the basic starting capital you need to do that. Your talent are the people that will create the galvanizing experiences, and your unions and other participating audience members are the ones that should clearly be featured as the people that you're trying to support, that you're trying to benefit, and that you're trying to ultimately use to be stronger together, as Steve Klasko just said in his own organization in healthcare.
Jasper?
Well, I'm very much concerned about the fact that institutions are in this crisis all around the world, are somehow in a way prioritizing their own existence and therefore in a way neglecting their responsibility for the extended family of the artists, of the supply side, myriad numbers of small companies and suppliers who do everything from, I don't know, printing and distribution. I mean, there is a huge network. I mean, there's a nice example I like to quote of this wonderful book by Peter Wohlleben about the hidden life of trees, and that the forest is supported by this amazing underground network of roots and of other sort of sustaining elements. And without that, if you cut that, you in the end kill the trees. And I think that what is going badly wrong at the moment is, and also when it comes to philanthropy, I think that the institution leaders should be spending a lot of time and energy convincing the philanthropists to support the creative work of the artists, and to think that at least a relatively small part of their philanthropy should be directed precisely towards this opportunity for innovation, change, risk-taking. And I see very little of that. Very little of it in Europe, and as far as I can see, very little of it in the States. And I think that that is a sea change which we need to bring in order to democratize also the value of the artist's creativity.
Mm.
I'd like to read a question and maybe direct it first to you, Larry, for your comments, which I think is emblematic of a lot of folks thinking at this point around sort of where do we go from here. There have been so many questions, and now here it is. Everything we've known about our markets has been thrown out the window. So are there anchors we can hook onto from which to innovate? How do we understand what is competitive or extraordinary thinking? I think a pretty insightful question, Larry, and I'm curious as to your reaction to it.
Okay, it's a juicy, tough topic to do shortly, but or concisely. But at the heart of it, really, and especially around any artist expression or artist organization, is the universalities of human beings. Even amid this sort of scary time of change, one of the things you completely can count on is that there's a deep structure to what humans need, what they care about, what they want to do in their lives. They care about their families. They're fearful about how they're going to thrive and survive. To Jasper's point a moment ago, the last thing an arts organization should do is focus hyper intensely on its own survival. What it really needs to do is to get to the larger cultural moment that we're in and look for ways to get out of the way of your talented artists who are going to have extraordinarily rich and varied ways to interpret and to express what they're going through, what their families are going through. So that's the heart of it, Chris, is the ability to tap into the zeitgeist and to the deep taproot of human experience and emotion and anxiety. Outside of that, one of the deeper conversations going on in the group chat is about how you de-risk innovation. There's lots of talk in the chat room about either failing fast or trying to balance courage and caution. What I'd like to suggest as a very useful way for the arts organizations to hang on to this entire conversation is that inside of the world of innovation, there's a whole deep topic called de-risking bold action. So it seems paradoxical to most people that they're supposed to be bold in a time of terrifying change. But I'm going to give you the opposite point of view, that the only thing people can pay attention to, the only thing that breaks through in their own fears, sitting in their homes and with their families and worried about their income, is something that is in fact resonant, that does in fact act boldly. And so the paradox, or the solution to the paradox that people are expressing in the group chat, how to be both courageous and cautious at the same time, because all arts organizations, sort of live very close to the edge, is a surprisingly simple notion that to a very large extent, it'll be the boldest among you, the ones that try to get their unfair share of attention, the ones that most trust their own talent, that are likely to find their pathway to surviving and thriving to be easier rather than harder.
I would say
excuse
that.
me.
Why don't we go to Jasper and then Alan?
Okay.
Well, I'll just, I mean, one of the things which I am hoping will come out of this crisis is that the most articulate, but also everybody who is involved in this, as you just described, this fundamental value that motivates and drives humans in terms of their own feelings about their potential, is that they will become better advocates of these values in the society as a whole. It is shocking to me to see how little or how small the voice is of the creative world in terms of politics and of the bigger public arena. And I mean, when one heard just 10 days ago when Angela Merkel stood up and said, arts, the culture, the history, the legacy is fundamental to the well-being and health of our nation in every aspect. And the artists are at the core of that. And we will support the artists, and we will give the artists the opportunity to be artists and to survive. I find that enormously powerful, but I think that we are, all of us, too poor in our coming together to make that point, so that people actually begin to believe in this as being as important in life as health and everything else, because it is actually also part of the health of the spirit, which is also without which we are not humans.
Yeah. Alan, thank you for that, Jasper. Alan, we'll give you the last word.
Well, I am not so discouraged. I took part in a 4.5-hour meeting at the Aspen City Council last night. And the theme of the whole meeting was for the city council and staff to say, what can we do for you in the arts and culture sector? Because we need you. And we want you to be there. And as we said at the beginning of this meeting, when we open up again, it will be arts organizations that lead the task of bringing people together and expressing what we've been through and reflecting on what we've been through. So I feel good about that. I'm very often in meetings with valued colleagues who say to me, how can you be certain this plan will work? How can you be certain this is the right process? And I say, I'm not certain of a single thing, except that what we have always done has been of value, and we have to find something of value to continue doing in order to justify that we exist. So I am, of course, leading an organization. I'm not against organizations in the arts. I don't think they're deleterious in what they have always done and what they will do in the future. But we do need to have first in mind, why was it important that we existed? And why will it be important again that we exist?
Thank you, Alan. I'm going to turn it over back to Steve Kett to bring us home here in a second, but I do want to acknowledge there's so many interesting comments and questions that we didn't get to in the chat room. The risk of tackling a topic like this, even in 90 minutes, is that you end up only scratching the surface. But I believe that this conversation at least gave us some good food for thought to begin this process. It is our commitment at the Advisory Board for the Arts to be as helpful as we can in this endeavor. It is a topic that we care deeply about, and we'll do everything we can to be supportive. One final, I want to at least read one final comment here to just give us a sense for the breadth of this topic. somebody wrote, there are some real supply demand and expense income issues at play here that I think we must address if the arts is going to have an Amazon moment. Could not agree more, and that's a topic we didn't even get to really in any sort of depth in this conversation, and is another huge piece of this whole sort of bucket. So,
Chris, I just say something. That's a whole nother webinar we could have on how you increase demand that people weren't able to get into to your arts the way that they did pre-COVID. The increasing demand is going to be an amazing opportunity.
Thank you, Steve, for signing up for another webinar. I appreciate it.
Well, listen, Chris,
I throw in one other point, which we also did not touch at all, but I think it's crucial, is that our engagement in the subject of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which arts organizations have had an extremely mixed ability to do. This may be a time when we can really rethink how we reach out to people who were not served by what we did in the past. So,
absolutely.
So,
massive additional piece of this.
Thank you very much. As we close here, can't thank Alan and Larry and Steve and Jasper enough for, even though, as Chris just said, just scratching the surface, it was the fastest 90 minutes I've spent on Zoom in a long time. So I really do appreciate your time, your thoughts, your hopes, and aspirations, because it's obviously something that we all, this world of the arts that we care deeply about. Just a quick note that by joining this conversation today, you will receive a summary, a written summary of the conversation, as well as future notifications of future webinars. The ABA Live series is an ongoing series, but our series is going to change in the coming weeks. With the advent of our first member meeting series getting underway later this month, our next webinar will be held on Wednesday, not Tuesday, but Wednesday, June 3rd. And thereafter, we'll be hosting these every other week as opposed to every week. Please do mark the date and plan on joining us, though, on June 3rd, as we will have a fantastic global panel of leading museum directors, including Kaywin Feldman, the director of the National Gallery of Art here in Washington, D.C., and Eike Schmidt, the director of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. If you'd like to receive notifications of these webinars, please visit our Arts Resilience Center on our website, whose address is seen here. And finally, the Advisory Board for the Arts is a membership organization, and while we are making several resources available to non-members during this crisis, we offer a much broader array of research and services to our members. You can see here on this screen some of those services specifically designed to helping our members navigate the current crisis. If you're a guest on this call and would like more information about us and how we operate, how we work, and how we might help, you'll find my personal email address in the chat box. Just click on it, send me a note. I'd be delighted to speak with you. You will now see a polling question. We want to get your feedback. If you would leave this question up for just a moment, Karen, if everyone would take a moment to give us your feedback, we sure would appreciate it. And of course, feel free to sign off when finished. And so I'll thank Alan, Larry, Steve, and Jasper one final time and let them know that they may sign off now at any time. Everyone, thank you. Thank you all very, very much.
Thanks very much.
And everyone on this call, please stay safe and be well. And thanks again so much for joining us today.